The thermometer nailed to the post inside Silas Cobb's barn read 62 degrees. Outside, the January wind screamed across the Montana plains at 40 below zero. The men who had called him a lunatic, a fool, and worse stood shoulder to shoulder in the warmth, their breath coming easy, their coats unbuttoned, their faces slack with disbelief. Silas had not slept in 3 days. His hands were wrapped in cloth bandages soaked through with blood from where the metal edges had split his palms open. His wife Margaret sat in a rocking chair in the loft above the livestock pens, a wool blanket across her lap, reading a letter from her sister in Philadelphia by the light of an oil lamp. She was not shivering. Neither were their 2 children, asleep in the bed behind the canvas partition. The cows below them breathed and shifted and generated heat that rose through the slatted floor and filled the living space like a blessing from a God that Silas had stopped believing in 11 years ago, when his first wife and infant son had frozen to death in a structure not so different from the ones his neighbors still inhabited. Silas Cobb had buried 2 people he loved because the world told him there was only one way to build shelter against the cold. He had spent the next decade learning that the world was wrong. He had measured and calculated and argued and bled, and now he stood in the center of his impossible barn while the worst blizzard in 20 years tried to murder everyone within 50 miles of the Yellowstone River, and his family was warm. That morning, before the storm had reached its full fury, 3 of his neighbors had pounded on the outer door of his structure, begging for refuge. By afternoon, there were 11. By nightfall, 23 men, women, and children had crowded into the building that the entire territory had mocked for 2 years. The banker, Horace Whitfield, who had denied Silas a loan to purchase additional corrugated sheeting, stood against the east wall with his wife and daughter, saying nothing, looking at his boots. The ranch foreman, Buck Dawson, who had laughed in Silas's face at the general store and called the structure a metal coffin waiting to happen, sat on a hay bale with his hat in his hands, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Even Thomas Greery was there. Thomas Greery, who had started the petition to have Silas declared mentally unfit. Thomas Greery, who had tried to have Silas's children taken away by the territorial authority on grounds that no sane man would house his family in such a contraption. Thomas Greery stood in the corner with his arms crossed, his jaw tight, watching the thermometer on the post as if expecting it to suddenly plummet and prove him right after all. It did not plummet. Silas walked to the center of the structure, where the main support beam rose from the floor and disappeared into the curved ceiling far overhead. He placed his bandaged hand against the wood. The beam was warm. Everything was warm. He had spent 2 years trying to explain to these people why this would work, and they had refused to listen. Now the explanation was the air they were breathing. Margaret looked down from the loft. She did not smile. She did not need to. They both understood what this night meant. 102 degrees. That was the difference between the temperature inside Silas's barn and the temperature outside. The walls of a standard cabin, even a well-built one with good chinking between the logs, might hold 15 or 20 degrees against the cold on a night like this. The fanciest houses in Helena, with their double walls and coal stoves burning day and night, might manage 30 or 40. Silas Cobb's barn held 102 degrees against the Montana winter, and it did it with nothing but livestock heat, an air gap, and geometry. The storm had started 3 days earlier, on the morning of January 14th, 1887. Silas had been in the barn when the sky changed color. He had looked west and seen the wall of white descending from the mountains, and he had known immediately that this was not an ordinary blizzard. He had seen storms like this before. He had seen what they did to men and cattle and buildings. He had walked outside and stood in the last minutes of relative calm, watching the death that was coming. and he had felt something he had not felt in years. He felt ready. The structure that rose behind him was unlike anything else in the territory. His neighbors called it many things: the metal barn, the crazy barn, Cobb's Folly, the coffin. What it actually was, in technical terms, was a standard timber frame barn enclosed within a larger arched shell made of curved wooden ribs and corrugated galvanized iron sheeting. The outer shell rose 22 feet at its peak and extended 60 feet in length and 32 feet in width. The inner barn, which had existed on the property when Silas bought it in 1884, measured 48 feet by 24 feet by 14 feet at the ridge. This meant there was an air gap of between 4 and 8 feet on all sides between the roof and walls of the inner barn and the inner surface of the outer shell. That air gap was the key to everything. Silas had tried to explain this so many times. He had drawn diagrams. He had cited articles from agricultural journals back east. He had even written to a professor at a college in Massachusetts, who had responded with a 12-page letter full of calculations that confirmed everything Silas believed. None of it mattered. The people of this territory did not trust diagrams or journals or professors. They trusted tradition. They trusted what their fathers had done and their grandfathers before them. They built cabins with thick log walls, and they stuffed the gaps with mud and moss, and they huddled around their stoves, and they prayed for spring, and when the bad winters came, some of them died. Rachel and the baby had died in a cabin exactly like that. 1876. The winter that killed the 7th Cavalry had killed them too, though no one wrote songs about a young mother and her infant freezing in their beds, while their husband and father rode through chest-deep snow, trying to reach them with firewood that arrived too late. Silas had found them on the morning of December 28th. Rachel was curled around the baby, trying to keep him warm with the last heat of her own dying body. The stove had gone cold. The temperature inside the cabin, when Silas forced open the frozen door, was 4 degrees below zero. 4 degrees below zero. In a cabin with walls 8 inches thick. After he buried them, Silas did not speak for 3 months. He worked. He chopped wood, and he tended his remaining livestock, and he fixed things that were broken, and he did not speak to anyone about anything. The neighbors left food on his porch, and he brought it inside, and sometimes he ate it, and sometimes he did not. The preacher came by twice, and Silas did not answer the door. The preacher left a Bible on the porch, and Silas used it to start a fire. In April of 1877, Silas rode to Helena and spent 6 hours in the territorial library reading everything he could find about heat and cold and the movement of warmth through solid objects. He did not understand all of it. He had left school at 14 to work his father's farm in Ohio, but he understood enough to know that there had to be a better way. The first thing he learned was that air does not conduct heat well. A pocket of still air acts as an insulator, slowing the transfer of warmth from one place to another. This was why quilts worked better than single blankets. This was why 2 thin coats with air between them kept a man warmer than 1 thick coat. This was why the fancy houses back east were starting to be built with double walls. The second thing he learned was that heat rises. This seemed obvious once he thought about it. Everyone knew that the upper floors of buildings were warmer than the lower floors. Everyone knew that hot air balloons floated because the heated air inside them was lighter than the cold air outside. But Silas had never considered what this meant for the design of a house or a barn. If heat rises, then any warmth generated at ground level will naturally flow upward. If you wanted to keep a living space warm, it made sense to put that living space above the source of heat, not beside it or below it. The third thing he learned was about animals. A mature cow generates roughly 400 British thermal units of heat per hour through its normal metabolic processes. A horse generates even more. This heat has to go somewhere. In a standard barn, most of it escapes through the roof and walls, lost to the outside air. But what if you captured that heat? What if you built a structure that held it in and directed it where you wanted it to go? Silas spent the next 7 years thinking about these principles. He worked as a ranch hand in Colorado and Wyoming, saving money, observing how different buildings performed in different conditions. He experimented when he could. He built a small shelter for chickens that incorporated a dead air space between double walls, and the chickens survived a winter that killed half the birds in the county. He modified a bunkhouse to include a loft above a stable area, and the men who slept in that loft reported that they were warmer than the men in the main building with its 2 iron stoves. In 1884, he had saved enough to buy a small ranch in Montana Territory, 30 miles east of Billings. The property came with a standard barn, a dilapidated cabin, and 320 acres of grassland. Silas tore down the cabin on the first day. He moved into the barn and began planning. The idea came to him fully formed one night in October, as if it had been waiting in his mind, all along for the right moment to emerge. He would build a shell over the existing barn, not just a larger barn, but a curved shell that would create a continuous pocket of trapped air around the entire structure. The curve was important. A flat roof leaked heat at the peak. A curved roof distributed the trapped air more evenly and allowed the warmth to circulate. The livestock would live on the ground floor of the inner barn. Their body heat would rise through a slatted floor into a loft space above, where Silas and any future family would live. The outer shell would hold this heat in. The air gap would prevent it from conducting through to the cold outside. He drew the plans on butcher paper. He calculated the amount of material he would need. He figured that 20 cows, which was what he planned to maintain, would generate roughly 8,000 British thermal units of heat per hour. If he could capture even half of that, it would be more than enough to keep the living space above 60 degrees in all but the most extreme conditions. The problem was the outer shell. A standard rectangular structure would not work. The angles would create pockets where cold air could settle and where heat could concentrate uselessly. What he needed was a curved form, something like an enormous overturned boat that would create a smooth and continuous airspace. He thought about this for weeks. He talked to blacksmiths and carpenters and anyone who would listen, which was not many. Most people dismissed him as soon as he started explaining. A few listened politely and then shook their heads. One blacksmith in Billings, a German immigrant named Otto Brenner, did more than listen. He asked questions. Otto had worked in a factory in Dusseldorf that manufactured corrugated iron sheets for export. He knew how the material behaved, how it could be cut and bent and fastened. He told Silas that corrugated iron could be curved if you worked it properly, bending it slowly over a form to avoid cracking. He said that wooden ribs could be shaped using steam, the same way shipbuilders made the ribs of boats. He said that a structure like Silas was describing was not impossible. It was merely unprecedented. Silas hired Otto as a consultant. Over the winter of 1884 to 85, they designed the outer shell together. The plan called for 12 curved wooden ribs made of laminated pine, each rib consisting of 3-inch boards glued and bolted together and bent over a form. The ribs would be spaced 5 feet apart along the length of the structure. Corrugated galvanized iron sheets would be fastened to the outside of the ribs, overlapping by 4 inches at each seam and sealed with tar to prevent water infiltration. The entire structure would rest on a stone foundation that would insulate the ground floor from the frozen earth below. The cost would be significant. Silas calculated that he needed approximately 2,000 square feet of corrugated iron sheeting, which at the current price of 8 cents per square foot would cost $160 for materials alone. The laminated pine for the ribs would add another $70. Hardware, tar, stone for the foundation, and miscellaneous supplies would bring the total to approximately $300, not including labor. Silas had saved just over $400. He went to the bank in Billings to discuss a loan that would allow him to purchase materials more quickly and begin construction before winter. The banker was Horace Whitfield, a thin man with spectacles and a permanent expression of mild distaste. Whitfield listened to Silas's proposal for approximately 4 minutes before interrupting. "What you're describing," Whitfield said, "is not a barn. It is a novelty. This bank does not finance novelties." Silas tried to explain the principles involved. He had brought his calculations, his diagrams, even the letter from the professor in Massachusetts. Whitfield did not look at any of it. "Mr. Cobb," Whitfield said, "I have lived in this territory for 11 years. I've seen many men come here with unusual ideas. Most of them are dead now, or gone back east. The ones who survived did so by doing things the way they have always been done. If you want to build a proper cabin and a proper barn, this bank will consider a loan. If you want to build a metal tent over your existing barn, you will do so with your own money." Silas left the bank and did not go back. He spent the spring and summer of 1885 preparing. He cut timber from the hills south of his property and hauled it to a steam-bending operation in Billings, where he paid to have the boards shaped into the curved forms he needed. He made 3 trips to Helena to purchase corrugated iron, loading as much as his wagon could carry each time. He dug the foundation trenches himself, working from dawn until he could no longer see his hands in front of his face. His neighbors noticed. Of course they noticed. A man building something strange always draws attention, and what Silas was building was very strange indeed. The first to confront him directly was Buck Dawson, the foreman of the rocking tea ranch that bordered Silas's property to the west. Dawson was a large man with a red face and hands like shovels. He rode over one afternoon in July and sat on his horse watching Silas dig for nearly an hour before speaking. "What in the hell are you building, Cobb?" Silas did not stop digging. "A barn," he said. "That is not a barn. A barn has walls and a roof. What you are building looks like a railroad tunnel. It will have walls and a roof. They will just be shaped differently than you are used to." Dawson spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "I heard you went to Whitfield asking for money for this thing." "He turned you down, did he?" "He did." Dawson laughed. "Whitfield is a fool about most things, but he is not a fool about money. If he would not finance this, there is a reason. You are wasting your time, Cobb, and when winter comes and this contraption of yours collapses under the snow, you will have wasted your money too." Silas straightened up and looked at Dawson for the first time. "Thank you for your concern," he said. "Is there anything else?" Dawson stared at him for a long moment. Then he shook his head and rode away. Others came. Some were curious. Most were contemptuous. Thomas Greery, who owned the largest ranch in the valley and considered himself the informal leader of the community, visited in September when the frame of the outer shell was nearly complete. Greery was a tall man with silver hair and an air of authority that Silas found deeply irritating. He walked around the structure 3 times, poking at the wooden ribs, examining the joints, saying nothing. Finally, he stopped in front of Silas and crossed his arms. "This is unsafe," Greery said. Silas was on a ladder, fastening a brace between 2 ribs. "How so?" he asked without looking down. "The structure is not sound. These curved members cannot bear the load of a heavy snow. When the first real storm hits, this entire thing will come down. If you are inside when it happens, you will die. If your family is inside, they will die too." Now Silas looked down. "I have calculated the load capacity," he said. The ribs are laminated pine, 3 inches thick, with steel bolts at every joint. Each rib can bear 2,000 pounds. There are 12 ribs. That is 24,000 pounds of load capacity. The heaviest snow load this region has recorded in the past 30 years was 40 pounds per square foot. The surface area of the roof is approximately 2,000 square feet. That is 80,000 pounds of potential load. Greery frowned. Those numbers do not add up. You just said the capacity is 24,000 pounds. I did not say the ribs alone would bear the load, Silas said. The corrugated iron sheeting adds significant structural strength. The curves distribute the weight to the foundation walls. The entire system works together. I have consulted with engineers. Greery's frown deepened. Engineers back east do not understand Montana winters. I understand Montana winters, Silas said. He came down the ladder and stood facing Greery. I understand them better than anyone in this valley. I lost my wife and son to a Montana winter. They froze to death in a cabin that everyone told me was built the right way. So do not tell me about Montana winters, Mr. Greery. I know exactly what they can do, and I know that your way of building does not work. Something shifted in Greery's expression. For a moment he looked almost sympathetic. Then his face hardened again. I'm sorry for your loss, he said, but grief does not make a man an engineer. This structure is dangerous. If you move your family into it, you are putting them at risk. I intend to raise this matter with the territorial authority. Do what you need to do, Silas said. I will do what I need to do. Greery left. A week later, a man from the territorial office arrived to inspect the structure. He was young, nervous, clearly uncomfortable with his assignment. He poked around for an hour, asked Silas a few questions, took some notes, and rode away. 2 weeks after that, Silas received a letter informing him that the territorial authority had declined to take action, as there was no specific regulation prohibiting the type of construction he was engaged in. However, the letter added, any injuries or deaths resulting from structural failure would be his responsibility, and he would be liable for any damage to neighboring properties. Silas filed the letter and continued building. By November, the outer shell was complete. The corrugated iron gleamed dully in the autumn sun, curving over the existing barn like the ribcage of some enormous metal beast. Silas had left openings at each end, fitted with heavy wooden doors that could be sealed against the wind. He had installed vents near the peak of the curve that could be opened to release excess moisture or closed to retain heat. He had laid a stone floor in the gap between the inner barn and the outer shell, creating a walkway that allowed access to all sides of the interior structure. The neighbors came to look. Some laughed. Some shook their heads. Some said nothing at all, just stared at the thing as if trying to understand what they were seeing. The children called it the metal whale. The adults called it other things. Winter came early that year. The first snow fell on November 19th. Silas watched from inside the structure as the flakes accumulated on the curved roof, sliding down the sides to pile against the foundation walls. By morning, there were 8 inches on the ground. The temperature inside the air gap, measured by a thermometer Silas had mounted on the wall of the inner barn, was 34 degrees. The temperature outside was 12 degrees. A difference of 22 degrees, with no fire burning and only 4 cows in the lower level. Silas added more livestock. He purchased 12 additional cows and 6 horses from a rancher who was selling out and moving to California. He built the slatted floor for the loft, spacing the boards 1 inch apart to allow heat to rise while preventing hay and other debris from falling through. He constructed the living quarters above the animal pens, a space measuring 24 feet by 16 feet with a ceiling height of 7 feet. He installed a small iron stove for cooking and emergency heating. but his calculation suggested he would rarely need it. Margaret arrived on December 3rd. She had been living with her sister in Philadelphia while Silas prepared the homestead. They had been corresponding by letter for 2 years, having been introduced through a mutual acquaintance who thought they might suit each other. Margaret was 31 years old, a widow herself, practical and unromantic, and exactly what Silas needed. She had read his descriptions of the structure he was building and had responded with questions rather than ridicule. She had asked about insulation values and livestock heat generation and moisture management. She had suggested improvements to his ventilation system. She had decided to marry him based largely on the logic of his plans. When she arrived and saw the structure for the first time, she stood in the wagon for a long moment looking at it. "It is larger than I expected," she said. Silas helped her down. "Does it trouble you?" "No," she said. She was still looking at the curved metal roof. "It makes sense." "I can see that it makes sense. It just takes a moment to adjust." That was the closest Margaret ever came to expressing doubt. She moved into the loft that evening and began arranging their household goods while Silas fed the livestock below. The temperature outside was 9 degrees. The temperature in the loft, warmed by the breath and bodies of 18 animals, was 52 degrees. Margaret did not light the stove that night. She did not light it the next night either. A week passed before she finally used it to cook dinner, and even then she remarked that the room felt almost too warm afterward. Christmas came. The children from neighboring ranches received dolls and wooden toys and new clothes. Margaret received a silver brush and comb set that Silas had ordered from a catalog in November. Silas received a pair of wool socks that Margaret had knitted herself, and a letter from Otto Brenner congratulating him on completing the project. The winter continued. January arrived with bitter cold and howling wind. The thermometer outside Silas's structure dropped to 27 below zero on the night of January 7th. The thermometer inside the loft read 58 degrees. Silas recorded these numbers in a journal he had started keeping. He recorded them every day, 3 times a day, along with notes about weather conditions, livestock behavior, and fuel consumption, which remained at 0. His neighbors were not faring as well. He heard reports of cattle dying in the open range, unable to find shelter. He heard about a family on the far side of the valley whose cabin had burned down when they overstoked their stove trying to stay warm. The father had survived. The mother and 3 children had not. He heard that Buck Dawson's ranch had lost 40 head of cattle in a single night when a blizzard caught them in an open pasture. And then, on January 14th, the big storm came. Silas saw it approaching from the west, a wall of white that stretched from horizon to horizon. He had seen storms like this before. He remembered 1876. He remembered the snow that had buried the entire territory, that had killed thousands of cattle, that had frozen his wife and son in their beds. He brought the horses in from the small paddock and secured them in the lower level of the barn. He checked the door seals and the ventilation vents. He climbed to the loft and found Margaret sitting by the window, watching the wall of white advance across the plains. "It is going to be bad," she said. "Yes," Silas said. Margaret turned to look at him. "We are ready." Silas nodded. He did not tell her about the fear that still lived in his chest, the fear that never went away, the fear that he had built this entire structure to try to silence. He did not tell her about the nightmares he still had, the dreams where he opened the cabin door and found Rachel and the baby frozen and dead. He did not tell her that he had spent the last 10 years of his life preparing for exactly this moment, and that he still was not certain it would be enough. "We are ready," he said. The storm hit within the hour. The wind came first, screaming across the plains and slamming into the structure with a force that made the metal sheeting vibrate like a drum. Then came the snow, dense and blinding, driven horizontal by the gale. The temperature dropped so fast that ice formed on the inside of the wooden doors. Silas could hear it cracking and popping as the cold contracted the timber. The first neighbors arrived that evening. It was the Morrison family, a husband and wife, and their 2 young sons. They had been trying to reach Billings when the storm caught them. Their wagon was buried somewhere on the road. They had walked the last 2 miles in near-zero visibility, following the fence line that led to Silas's property. Morrison was a quiet man who had never said much to Silas one way or the other. His wife was shivering so violently she could not speak. The boys, ages 6 and 8, had frost on their eyelashes. Silas brought them inside and led them to the loft, where Margaret had already prepared hot coffee and blankets. The temperature in the loft was 61 degrees. Morrison stopped at the top of the ladder and looked around. He looked at the thermometer on the post. He looked at the slatted floor. He looked at the curved ceiling far above, dimly visible in the lamplight. He opened his mouth to say something, then closed it again. "Thank you," he finally said. "That was all. Thank you." More came. The Hendricks family from the ranch to the south. Old man Peterson, who lived alone and should have died on a night like this, but had somehow managed to reach the structure. The Dawsons came, Buck and his wife and their 3 children, none of them looking at Silas as they climbed into the loft. The Whitfields came, the banker and his wife and daughter, Horace Whitfield's face pale and drawn as he stood in the warmth and said nothing at all. Thomas Greery came last. He came alone, his horse dead somewhere behind him, ice in his beard and blood on his hands where the rains had torn his skin. He stood in the doorway of the outer shell for a long moment, looking at Silas. Then he looked at the structure around them. Then he looked at the thermometer on the post. 62 degrees, Greery said. Silas nodded. Greery said nothing else. He walked to the far corner of the loft and sat down with his back against the wall and did not move for the next 14 hours. The storm lasted 3 days. On the first night, the temperature outside dropped to 42 below zero. The temperature inside the loft held at 58 degrees, warmed by the bodies of 23 refugees and 18 animals and nothing else. On the second night, the temperature outside rose slightly to 35 below, and the loft reached 64 degrees. By the third morning, when the wind finally died and the sun broke through the clouds, the temperature outside was 12 below zero, and the temperature inside was 61 degrees. 102 degrees of difference at the peak of the storm. 60 degrees of difference even now, with the worst of it past. Silas stood at the outer door of the structure and looked at what the storm had done to the world. The snow lay in drifts 15 feet high against the windward walls of his neighbors' cabins. Fence posts had vanished entirely. The road to Billings was buried under a white sea that stretched unbroken to the horizon. Nothing moved. No birds sang. The only sound was the creak of settling snow and the distant lowing of cattle that had somehow survived. He walked back inside and climbed to the loft. The refugees were stirring, some of them eating the breakfast that Margaret had prepared, others simply sitting and staring at the walls. The children were playing quietly in the corner, too young to understand what had happened, too young to know how close they had come to dying. Thomas Greery was standing by the thermometer post. He had not moved from his corner all night, but now he was up, examining the instrument as if he expected to find some trick, some hidden mechanism that would explain away what he was seeing. Silas walked over and stood beside him. The thermometer read 59 degrees. Outside, according to the instrument mounted on the exterior of the outer shell, it was still 8 degrees below zero. Greery did not look at him. "How does it work?" he said. It was the first time anyone had asked. Silas had explained the theory dozens of times, but no one had ever asked how it actually worked, how the principles translated into the warmth they were feeling. The animals, Silas said, each cow produces about 400 units of heat per hour. I have 18 cattle and 6 horses in the lower level. That is roughly 10,000 units of heat every hour, day and night, whether I tend them or not. Greery frowned. Other barns have animals. They are not warm like this. Other barns lose that heat, Silas said. The walls conduct it outside. The roof lets it escape. The heat rises to the peak and passes right through the boards into the cold air above. You might as well try to warm your house by opening the door and letting the heat from your stove blow away in the wind, so you trap it. I trap it. The outer shell creates a space of dead air around the inner barn. Air does not conduct heat well. It acts as a barrier. The warmth from the animals rises into the loft instead of escaping through the roof. The loft floor is made of slats, 1 inch apart, so the heat can pass through, but the space remains separate from the animal quarters below. Greery looked up at the curved ceiling. And the shape, he said. Why curved? Several reasons, Silas said. A curved surface sheds snow better than a flat one. The weight slides off instead of accumulating. A curved structure is also stronger. The load distributes evenly across the entire form instead of concentrating at the peak. And the curve creates a more consistent air gap. A rectangular shell would have corners where cold air could pool and where the insulating effect would be reduced. Greery was quiet for a long moment. He reached out and touched the post where the thermometer was mounted. The wood was warm. I tried to have you declared unfit, he said. I told the territorial authority that you were a danger to your family. I told them this structure would collapse and kill everyone inside. I know, Silas said. I was wrong. Silas did not respond. He had waited 10 years to hear those words from someone, and now that he was hearing them, he found that they meant less than he had expected. Rachel and the baby were still dead. The years of mockery and isolation were still real. Being right did not undo any of it. Greery turned to face him. I have a proposal, he said. Silas waited. When this storm clears, I am going to lose cattle. Everyone in this valley is going to lose cattle. The ones that survived will be weak, and many of them will die before spring. I want to bring my remaining herd here. I want to shelter them in your structure until the weather breaks. The lower level is full, Silas said. I cannot take more animals. Then build another structure. Build one for me. I will pay for the materials and the labor. I will pay whatever you ask. Silas looked at Greery. The man's face was drawn, exhausted, stripped of the arrogance that had always defined him. He looked like what he was, a rancher, face in ruin, a man who had built his life on assumptions that had just been proven wrong. I will think about it, Silas said. He walked away and climbed down the ladder to the lower level. The animals stood in their stalls, calm and warm, their breath fogging slightly in the cooler air near the ground. The temperature down here was 41 degrees, cold enough to keep the manure from becoming too pungent, but warm enough to keep the animals healthy. Silas had calculated this carefully. The slatted floor allowed the heat to rise while keeping the living quarters separate from the smell and mess below. He checked the water troughs. The water was not frozen. In a standard barn, the troughs would have been solid ice by now. Here, the ambient warmth kept them liquid. He checked the hay supply. There was enough for another week, maybe 2 if he rationed carefully. He would need to dig out the hay storage shed once the storm fully passed. Margaret found him there an hour later. She climbed down the ladder and stood beside him in the dim light that filtered through the gaps in the siding. Greery asked you to build for him, she said. It was not a question. He did. Will you do it? Silas picked up a pitchfork and began moving hay into the nearest stall. I do not know, he said. I did not build this to prove anything to anyone. I built it because I knew it would work. I built it because I never wanted to find another person I loved frozen to death because the world insisted on doing things the wrong way. Margaret watched him work. That is not an answer, she said. Silas stopped and leaned on the pitchfork. The truth is, he said, I do not know if I want to help him. He tried to have our children taken away. He called me a lunatic. He told everyone in the valley that I was dangerous. He was wrong, Margaret said. He knows he was wrong. Is that not enough? Silas shook his head. I do not know if it is enough. I know that if I help him, others will ask for help too. Dawson will ask. Whitfield will ask. Every rancher in this valley will want what I have, and they will expect me to give it to them because now they see that it works. Is that a bad thing? Silas looked at her. She was silhouetted against the light from above, her face in shadow. He could not read her expression. I spent 10 years on this, he said. I bled for it. I gave up everything else because I believed in it when no one else did. And now they want to share in what I built, not because they believed in it, but because they saw that it worked. They want the reward without having taken the risk. Margaret was silent for a moment. Then she said, Rachel would have wanted you to help them. Silas felt something tighten in his chest. That is not fair, he said. No, Margaret said. It is not fair. But it is true. You told me about her. You told me she was kind. You told me she would have given the coat off her back to a stranger in the cold. Would she want you to let children freeze because their fathers were fools? Silas did not answer. He could not answer. He turned away and continued moving hay, his movements sharp and angry, his jaw tight. Margaret watched him for a moment longer. Then she climbed back up the ladder and left him alone. The storm ended fully on the third day. The sky cleared and the sun emerged, blinding on the white expanse of snow. The temperature rose to 7 degrees above zero, almost warm compared to what they had endured. The refugees began to leave, one family at a time, digging their way back to their homesteads to assess the damage. The damage was severe. Silas heard the reports over the following days as neighbors returned to check on him and, though they did not say it, directly, to seek shelter if another storm came. The Hendricks family had lost their cabin entirely. The roof had collapsed under the weight of the snow. They were living in their barn now, huddled around a fire pit dug into the frozen ground. The Morrisons had found their wagon, buried under 8 feet of snow. One of their horses had died in the traces. The other was injured and would probably not survive the week. Buck Dawson had lost over 100 head of cattle. He stood in Silas's doorway and delivered this news in a flat voice, his face expressionless, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere past Silas's shoulder. The rocking tea was finished, he said. 20 years of work, gone in 3 days. He did not ask Silas for help. He did not ask for anything. He simply turned and walked away, his boots crunching in the snow, his shoulders bent like a man carrying a weight he could not put down. Horace Whitfield came by the following afternoon. He came alone without his wife or daughter, and he stood in the outer shell of the structure for a long time before speaking. I denied your loan request, he said. 2 years ago, you asked for $150 to purchase materials, and I told you this bank does not finance novelties. Silas remembered. He remembered every word of that conversation. Whitfield reached into his coat and produced an envelope. This is a draft for $500, he said. It is not a loan. It is a payment. I am purchasing a 10% stake in whatever enterprise you choose to build from this design. Silas did not take the envelope. What makes you think I want partners? He said. Whitfield's expression did not change. You do not want partners, he said. You want to build these structures. You want to prove to everyone that you were right and they were wrong. You want to watch them come to you and admit that you knew something they did not. I understand this. I would feel the same way in your position. Then why are you here? Because I am a banker, Whitfield said. I understand value. What you have built here is valuable, not just to you, not just to this valley, but to everyone who lives in a cold climate and cannot afford to lose livestock or family members to winter storms. This design could save lives across the entire territory. It could save lives across the country. But you cannot build that many structures alone. You need capital. You need workers. You need someone who understands how to turn an idea into an industry. Silas looked at the envelope in Whitfield's hand. $500 was more money than he had ever seen in one place. It was enough to build 4 or 5 additional structures. It was enough to hire workers and purchase materials in bulk. It was enough to do everything he had dreamed of doing but had never had the resources to accomplish. I need to think about it, he said. Whitfield nodded. He placed the envelope on a shelf near the door. Take your time, he said. I will be at the bank when you are ready to discuss terms. He left. Silas stood in the outer shell of his structure and looked at the envelope for a long time. Then he picked it up and carried it to the loft, where he placed it in the drawer of the small desk where he kept his journals and his calculations. That night, after Margaret and the children were asleep, Silas sat at that desk and wrote. He wrote about the storm and the refugees and the deaths that had occurred throughout the valley. He wrote about Greary's proposal and Whitfield's offer and the decision that lay before him. He wrote about Rachel and the baby, about the morning he had found them, about the years he had spent trying to build something that would prevent that horror from ever happening again. He wrote until the lamp burned low and his hand cramped and the words stopped coming. Then he put down the pen and looked at what he had written. The last line read, I did not build this to become rich. I built it to stop the dying. If I turn away now because I'm angry, I become part of the problem I was trying to solve. Silas stared at that line for a long time. Then he closed the journal and went to bed. The next morning he sent word to Thomas Greary. He would build the structure. The terms would be discussed in person. Greary arrived that afternoon, his horse picking its way carefully through the snow-covered road. He came into the outer shell and stood with his hat in his hands, waiting for Silas to speak. I have conditions, Silas said. Name them. First, I designed the structure. You do not interfere with the construction or the specifications. If I say the ribs must be 3 inches thick, they are 3 inches thick. If I say the air gap must be 5 feet, it is 5 feet. I will not compromise the integrity of the design to save money or time. Agreed, Greary said. Second, you pay for all materials and labor at the rates I specify. I have calculated the cost for a structure similar to this one at approximately $450. That includes lumber, corrugated iron, hardware, foundation stone, and labor for a crew of 4 men working for 6 weeks. Greary nodded. That's acceptable. Third, Silas said, you acknowledge publicly that you were wrong about me. You tell everyone in this valley that you tried to have me declared unfit and that you were mistaken. You tell them that this design works and that I knew what I was doing when no one else believed me. Greary's face tightened slightly. That is a difficult thing to ask, he said. Silas said nothing. He simply waited. Greary looked at the floor. Then he looked at the thermometer on the post. Then he looked at Silas. Agreed, he said. I will make the statement at the next town meeting. I will tell everyone what I did and why I was wrong. Silas extended his hand. Greery took it. They shook once, firmly, and then Greery left. The construction began in early February. The ground was still frozen, but Silas had learned techniques for working in cold weather. He brought in a crew of 4 men from Billings, experienced builders who asked few questions and did what they were told. They dug the foundation trenches using pickaxes and fire, heating the frozen earth with bonfires until it became soft enough to excavate. They hauled stone from a quarry 12 miles to the south, loading the wagon heavy and making the trip 3 times before they had enough. The ribs were the most difficult part. Silas had ordered the laminated pine boards in December before the storm, and they had been sitting in a storage shed in Billings waiting for pickup. He retrieved them in mid-February and spent a week with Otto Brenner, the German blacksmith, steaming and bending them into the proper curves. Each rib took an entire day to shape. Otto built a form from heavy timbers and thick iron bands, and they heated the laminated boards over a steam box until they became pliable, then bent them slowly over the form and clamped them in place until they cooled and held their shape. 12 ribs for Greery's structure, 12 days of work just for the frame. The corrugated iron came from Helena. Silas ordered 2,000 square feet, the same as his own structure, and paid cash from the money Greery had advanced. The sheets arrived on 3 wagons in early March, gleaming dull gray in the thin spring sunlight. The crew unloaded them carefully, stacking them on wooden platforms to keep them off the frozen ground. The assembly went faster than Silas had expected. The crew had watched him work and had learned his methods. They understood how the ribs needed to be spaced, how the sheeting needed to be overlapped, how the seams needed to be sealed. By the end of March, the outer shell was complete, curving over Greery's existing barn like a great metal beast crouching on the plains. Greery stood inside the completed structure and looked around. His face showed nothing, but his eyes moved constantly, taking in every detail, every joint, every curve. "When can I move the livestock in?" he asked. Silas explained the ventilation requirements, the moisture management, the slatted floor that would need to be installed if Greery wanted to create living quarters above. He explained the ratio of livestock to space, approximately 1 cow per 30 square feet of ground floor area, and the importance of maintaining that ratio to ensure adequate heat generation without excessive moisture or ammonia buildup. He explained the need for proper drainage, for regular cleaning of the lower level, for monitoring the temperature differential between inside and outside. Greery listened without interrupting. When Silas finished, he nodded once. "You have thought of everything," he said. "I have tried to," Silas said. "There may be problems I have not anticipated. This is only the second structure of this type ever built. We are still learning." Greery looked at him. "We," he said. Silas met his gaze. "I accepted Whitfield's offer," he said. "He is providing capital for additional construction. I am providing the design and the expertise. We are forming a company." Greery's eyebrows rose slightly. "A company," he repeated. "The Cobb Shelter Company," Silas said. "We will build these structures for anyone who wants them, anywhere in the territory. Whitfield believes we can expand to neighboring territories within 2 years. He believes there is significant demand." Greery was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed. It was a strange sound, unexpected, almost rusty from disuse. "2 months ago, I tried to have you committed to an asylum," he said. "Now you're starting a company. This territory never fails to surprise me." Silas did not laugh. He did not smile. "Life surprises everyone," he said. "The question is, what you do when it does." He left Greery standing in the completed structure and rode back to his own homestead. The spring thaw was beginning. The snow was melting. The road to Billings was becoming passable again. The world was waking up from its frozen sleep, and Silas had work to do. The summer of 1887 was the busiest of Silas's life. Orders came from across the valley, from ranchers who had seen Greery's structure and wanted their own. Orders came from beyond the valley, from men who had heard stories about the barn that had stayed warm through the worst blizzard in 20 years. Orders came from as far away as Dakota Territory and Wyoming, from cattle operations that had lost thousands of head in the winter of 86 to 87 and were desperate for any solution that might prevent such losses in the future. Silas could not build fast enough. He hired more workers. He trained them in his methods. He established a supply line with a corrugated iron manufacturer in Chicago who could ship materials directly to Montana by rail. He negotiated contracts with lumber mills in the mountain regions who could provide the specific grades of pine he needed for the curved ribs. By autumn, the Cobb Shelter Company had completed 7 structures in addition to the original 2. By the following spring, they had completed 14 more. By the summer of 1888, Silas was employing 30 workers and had a waiting list of orders that stretched into 1890. He did not forget why he had started. Every structure he built was a memorial to Rachel and the baby. Every family that survived a winter in one of his shelters was a victory over the cold that had taken everything from him. He kept a journal of the structures, noting the location, the dimensions, the names of the families who lived in them. He kept track of the winter temperatures, the livestock survival rates, the fuel consumption. He compiled the data and sent it to the professor in Massachusetts who had helped him with his early calculations. The professor responded with letters full of enthusiasm, urging Silas to publish his findings to share his methods with the wider world. Silas did not publish. He did not care about fame or recognition. He cared about the work. Margaret gave birth to their first child in September of 1887, a daughter they named Rachel after Silas's first wife. A son followed in 1889, whom they named Thomas, not after Greery but after Margaret's father, who had died the year before. The children grew up in the loft above the livestock, warmed by animal heat and dead air, and their father's determination to never let the cold take anyone from him again. The final test came in the winter of 1890 to 91. The old-timers said it was the worst winter since '76. The temperatures dropped to 50 below zero in January. The snow fell for 3 weeks without stopping. The wind howled across the plains like a living thing, hungry and relentless, searching for any weakness it could exploit. Silas had built 43 structures by then, 43 shelters, scattered across Montana and the neighboring territories, each one containing families and livestock, and the accumulated knowledge of 15 years of grief and study and work. He did not sleep during those 3 weeks. He rode from structure to structure, checking on the families, inspecting the buildings, looking for any sign of failure. He found none. Every structure held. Every thermometer showed the same impossible differential, 60 or 70 or 80 degrees between inside and outside. Every family was warm. Every herd survived. On the last day of the storm, Silas stood inside his original structure, the one he had built with his own hands, the one that had sheltered 23 refugees in the blizzard of '87. The thermometer read 64 degrees. Outside, it was 48 below zero, 112 degrees of difference. Margaret found him there, standing in the center of the lower level, his hand on the warm wood of the support beam. She did not speak. She simply stood beside him and waited. "They would have lived," Silas said. "If I had known then what I know now, they would have lived." Margaret took his hand. She did not tell him it was not his fault. She did not tell him he could not have known. She simply held his hand, and stood with him in the warmth while the cold raged outside, unable to touch them, unable to take anything more from him. The storm ended the next morning. The sun rose on a white world, silent and still, the snow glittering like diamonds in the early light. Silas walked outside and stood in the doorway of the outer shell, looking at the plains, looking at the mountains, looking at the sky. He thought about the men who had called him crazy. He thought about Greary and Whitfield and Buck Dawson and all the others who had laughed at him, who had mocked him, who had tried to stop him. He thought about the years of isolation and doubt, the nights when he had wondered if maybe they were right. Maybe he was a fool chasing an impossible dream. He thought about Rachel and the baby, frozen in their beds, waiting for help that came too late. He thought about the 43 families who had survived this winter because of what he had built. Then he went back inside, where his wife and children were waking up, where the livestock were stirring in their stalls, where the warmth rose through the slatted floor and filled the loft like a promise kept. He sat down at his desk and opened his journal and began to write. January 22nd, 1891, he wrote. Final temperature differential 112 degrees. All structures held. All families survived. He paused, the pen hovering over the page. Then he added one final line. They were wrong, and I was right. But being right was never the point. The point was making sure no one else had to learn the lesson the way I did. He closed the journal and put down the pen. Outside, the sun was rising higher, warming the snow, beginning the slow process of thaw that would bring another spring to Montana. Inside, the children were laughing, and Margaret was making breakfast, and the cows were lowing in their stalls, and the warmth wrapped around everything like a blanket, like a blessing, like the answer to a prayer that Silas had stopped believing in years ago, but had somehow been answered anyway. He stood up from the desk and went to join his family.